a stack of stone terraces in Queensland that half the country insists is an ancient pyramid, and the other half insists is a 19th century vineyard, with the truth still sitting somewhere in between. A field of thousands of limestone spires rising out of the sand near Perth, formed by a process scientists are still arguing over. A mountain in far North Queensland that locals have quietly avoided for generations, tied to disappearances no one has ever fully explained. Without further ado, let's get this video started. The turnoff sits on the Tin Can Bay Road, 5 kilometres northeast of a small Queensland town most Australians could not locate on a map. There is no grand entrance. A local sign with a phone number on it is the only marker. What sits above that turnoff is a rounded sandstone ridge, terraced in 6 or 7 low steps up its southern face, that has been the subject of one of Australia's longest running archaeological arguments for 50 years. Locals call it the Gympie Pyramid. What it actually is depends entirely on who you ask. The site is properly known as Rocky Ridge or Jaki Kundu to the Gubbi Gubbi and Kabi Kabi people, the traditional custodians of the land. It consists of stone terraces cut into a sandstone hillside, some retaining walls close to 1/2 metre high, built from loosely stacked local rock. Grinding grooves worn into rock at the top of the ridge show the site was used long before European settlement, though grinding grooves alone do not indicate what the terraces below them were built for or when. The terraces themselves have a documented paper trail. Geologists who surveyed the area in the late 1800s described a hill with loose stone, but neither mentioned anything resembling a pyramid. By 1875, the land had been taken up as a mining lease by a Swiss immigrant named John William Cowper, who had a serious published interest in viticulture. In 1884, Cowper wrote an article in the Gympie Times demonstrating detailed knowledge of vine growing and grafting. By 1905, the same newspaper was referring to the site simply as the Old Vineyard. The terraces, according to this record, are retaining walls for grapevines built to stop a slope from eroding. Nothing more exotic than that. That would be the end of the story, except for what turned up in the paddocks around it. The objects that complicate the record. In 1966, a farmer named Dale Berry was ploughing a nearby paddock when he unearthed a carved stone statue, since named the Gympie Ape. It is currently on display at the Gympie Gold Mining and Historical Museum, and it is real. What it depicts and who carved it is where the agreement ends. In 1978, amateur researcher Rex Gilroy claimed the statue had been identified as a 3,000-year-old representation of the Egyptian god Thoth, carved in his ape form. Later analysis by researcher Anthony Wheeler concluded it was more likely the work of Chinese gold prospectors who worked the Gympie goldfields in significant numbers during the 19th century, and are known to have carved similar devotional objects elsewhere in Australia. No conclusive dating of the statue has ever been published by either side. A second object, known as the Sunstone, was found in swampy ground near the site. A roughly shaped stone pillar carved with a sun symbol and 2 facing snakes. Claims have circulated for decades that the carvings were made using soft metal tools rather than modern implements, and that a university examined the piece and confirmed this. No published, peer-reviewed record of that examination has ever surfaced, and at least one archaeologist connected to the claim has denied ever seeing the stone. The sunstone's current whereabouts and its actual composition remain, as far as the public record shows, unresolved. In 2008, ahead of highway construction works near the site, Archaeo-Cultural Heritage Services of Brisbane conducted a formal cultural heritage survey. Their report concluded there was no evidence to support claims that the terraces were built by ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Mayan, Chinese, or extraterrestrial visitors. That finding has been the official position of Queensland heritage authorities ever since, and it is the conclusion most Australian archaeologists point to when the subject comes up. But not everyone accepts that the matter is closed. Archaeologist Greg Jeffries, who has worked directly on the site, has described it in his own writing as a serious and unexplained archaeological anomaly, and has argued that no full excavation has ever actually been carried out to settle the question either way. That is, on its own, a strange gap. A site that has generated 50 years of public argument, museum-held artefacts, and multiple competing theories from credentialed and amateur researchers alike, has never been the subject of a full-scale, ground-penetrating archaeological dig. The 2008 survey assessed heritage impact for a road project. It was not designed to be, and does not claim to be, a definitive excavation of what the terraces contain beneath their surface. The Aboriginal layer underneath. What tends to be lost in the pyramid argument is the site's actual documented significance to the Kabi people, who call it Jarki Kundu, and connect it to songlines involving the Seven Sisters and local water spirits. This is not folklore attached after the fact. It is a living connection, asserted by the community during protests in 2021, when construction on the Bruce Highway upgrade threatened to encroach on the site, leading to police removal of traditional owners occupying the ridge to halt the works. Whatever the terraces were built for by 19th century settlers, the ridge itself was known and significant to the Kabi long before Corpa ever planted a grapevine on it. That older layer of meaning has never been given equivalent weight in the pyramid debate on either the mainstream or the fringe side of it. What remains unresolved? The honest position, based on the public record, sits somewhere between the two extremes that usually get repeated online. It is not an ancient Egyptian mining colony. There is no credible physical evidence supporting Egyptian, Incan, or Chinese Ming Dynasty construction. And the paper trail for a 19th century vineyard terrace is genuinely solid. But it is also not a fully closed case in the way official summaries sometimes suggest. The Gympie ape has never been independently dated by a peer-reviewed institution. The Sunstone's claimed metallurgical analysis has never been published anywhere that can be checked, and the site itself, despite 50 years of public fascination, has never had a full archaeological excavation carried out on it, only a heritage impact assessment tied to a road project. What sits under Rocky Ridge, beneath the terraces settlers built, and the ridge the Kabi have always known, has not actually been dug up and examined the way a site with this much unresolved argument attached to it arguably should have been. The vineyard explanation accounts for the walls. It does not account for the objects found around them, and nobody with the authority to settle that question has yet done the work required to close it properly. The stone sits on private land today, largely overgrown, visited by a steady trickle of people chasing 50 years of an argument that official Queensland has called finished, and that at least one archaeologist who has actually stood on the ridge says is not finished at all. In 1658, Dutch sailors navigating the coast of Western Australia caught sight of something on the horizon that stopped them cold. Rising out of the desert scrub near the Indian Ocean were thousands of pale stone spires, some taller than a man standing on another man's shoulders, arranged across the landscape in a way that looked from a distance like the ruins of an ancient city. They were not ruins, they were not man-made. Scientists took another 300 years to settle on an explanation for how they got there, and even now, the debate is not entirely closed. What you are actually looking at, 200 kilometres north of Perth, inside Nambong National Park, near the small coastal town of Cervantes, the Pinnacles Desert covers roughly 190 hectares of yellow sand scattered with thousands of limestone pillars. Some reach 5 metres into the air. Others are barely knee-high, stubby and rounded, clustered alongside their taller neighbours like something arranged there deliberately. None of it was arranged deliberately. Every single one of them formed through a geological process that is still being debated in precise detail using raw material that began as the shells of marine creatures living in a shallow sea that covered this entire region millions of years ago. The park itself takes its name from an Aboriginal word, Nambung, most commonly translated as crooked or winding, a reference to the river that flows into the park and disappears into an underground cave system in the limestone. The Ued people are the traditional custodians of this country, and their connection to this landscape predates every geological survey and every tourist brochure by thousands of years. The park remained largely unknown to most Australians until 1967, when the area was formally gazetted as a reserve. It is now the most visited natural attraction in Western Australia outside of Perth itself, drawing visitors from around the world who arrive, walk among the spires, take photographs, and leave genuinely uncertain about what exactly they have just walked through. How scientists think they formed the raw material for every pillar in the pinnacles began as calcium carbonate, the same compound found in seashells and coral. When ancient seas retreated from this part of the coast, they left behind thick deposits of shell material that compressed and cemented over time into limestone. Coastal winds then carried that sand inland, building dunes that buried the limestone beneath them for thousands of years. What happened next is where the scientific debate begins. The most widely accepted theory involves plant roots. As coastal vegetation colonised the dune surface, plant roots drew moisture down through the sand, carrying dissolved calcium carbonate with them. As roots decayed, they left behind hollow tubes in the sand, and calcium carbonate slowly cemented the material around those tubes into harder columns. When the vegetation eventually died and the winds returned, they stripped away the softer surrounding sand, leaving the cemented columns standing exposed in the landscape they now occupy. A competing theory focuses on a different process entirely, karstification, the same chemical weathering responsible for cave systems worldwide. Under this explanation, slightly acidic rainwater percolated down through the limestone, dissolving it unevenly along natural lines of weakness and gradually carving the pillar shapes from below ground level before erosion exposed them. Both theories have genuine scientific support. Both explain some features of the pinnacles more convincingly than the other. Researchers publishing in geological journals as recently as 2023 have acknowledged that the precise mechanism is still not fully resolved, which for a landscape visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year and studied formally for decades, is a more interesting admission than it might first appear. What is not in dispute is the timeline. The pinnacles formed somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 years ago, placing their emergence in the landscape squarely within the period when Aboriginal Australians had already been living on this continent for tens of thousands of years. The people whose country this was did not discover the pinnacles any more than you discover your own backyard. They were simply there, watching a desert landscape gradually expose stone pillars from beneath the sand, and they incorporated what they saw into a relationship with this country that has never stopped. The Dutch thought it was a lost city. The documented European reaction to the pinnacles in 1658 is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it says something interesting about how people interpret a landscape they have no framework for. Dutch sailors exploring the Western Australian coast spotted the formations from offshore and, according to historical accounts, initially concluded they were looking at the ruins of an ancient city. The silhouettes of the taller pillars against the horizon, spaced irregularly across the plain, apparently resembled structural remains enough that experienced navigators who had seen ruins in Europe and the Middle East drew the same comparison independently. They were wrong, obviously, but the mistake is instructive. The pinnacles do not look like anything else in the natural world that most people have a reference point for. There is no standard mental category labelled thousands of limestone spires standing in yellow desert sand that a person encountering them for the first time can reach for, which is part of why they remain genuinely difficult to describe, even to someone who has seen photographs. The landscape also changes. Wind moves sand continuously across the desert floor, burying smaller pinnacles entirely, sometimes within days of their being exposed. Larger ones appear and disappear from view depending on the depth of sand surrounding them at any given time. The pinnacles visitors photographed last year are not exactly the same landscape as the one visitors will walk through next year. It is a desert that is literally rearranging itself around permanent stone structures, making the overall picture a moving target, even for researchers who have been studying it for decades. What the Noongar women knew for the Ued people. The pinnacles carry a specific cultural significance connected to women. Accounts collected from the Noongar community describe the desert as a gathering place for women, a location where groups came together for ceremony, for childbirth, and for camping under the open sky. The significance is not merely historical. It reflects an ongoing, living relationship with a specific landscape feature that European visitors have been treating as a scenic attraction since the 1960s, while the Ued people were doing something considerably more meaningful with it long before any survey team arrived. The park name itself carries this longer history quietly. Nambong, meaning crooked or winding, refers specifically to the river that flows into the park and then disappears underground into the cave system beneath the limestone. That disappearing river would have been a significant landmark in its own right, a freshwater source that vanishes into the ground in dry country. And it is the thing the Ued people named this place after, not the stone pillars that now bring the tourists. What remains genuinely unresolved? The question that researchers keep returning to is not whether the pinnacles are natural, they clearly are, but precisely which natural processes created them, in what sequence, and over what timescale. The pillar shapes are not consistent enough across the landscape to be explained comfortably by a single mechanism. Some have rounded tops. Some have mushroom-like caps, where a harder calcrete layer resisted erosion, while the softer stone beneath wore away faster. Some show cross-bedding lines that record changes in prevailing wind direction during their formation. Others show none of these features at all. The honest answer, as of 2023 research published in the National Rock Garden newsletter, is that the pinnacles probably formed through a combination of processes, with the relative contribution of each varying across different sections of the desert, depending on local conditions, the depth of the original limestone, the moisture content of the soil at different periods, and the direction of prevailing winds across millennia. That kind of answer is less satisfying than a single clean explanation, but it is more likely to be accurate. For a landscape that most visitors feel they have understood after an hour walking the designated trail with a map, the pinnacles have managed to resist a complete scientific account for longer than almost anyone who visits them realises. The Dutch sailors who thought they were looking at ruins were wrong about the specific conclusion, but right about one thing. This is a place that resists easy categorisation, and the more carefully you look at it, the less straightforward it becomes. If that is the kind of Australian story that interests you, subscribe and let us know in the comments which Western Australian mystery you think deserves the next look. A pile of black rock 25 kilometres south of a small Queensland town has swallowed people whole for a century and a half. Not metaphorically. Search parties have walked into its boulder field looking for someone missing and come back having found nothing at all. Not a boot, not a hat, not a single disturbed stone to suggest anyone had ever been there. This is the first video on a new channel built around exactly this kind of Australian story, the parts of our history that sit just outside the reach of a tidy explanation. If that sounds like your thing, this is the place to subscribe. Why search parties stopped going in. Most write-ups of Black Mountain list the disappearances and move on to the legend. Few stop to explain why finding someone there is so different from finding someone lost in ordinary bushland. Standard search procedure for a missing person relies on a handful of basic assumptions. People leave a trail, dogs can follow scent. A grid search on foot or from the air can usually rule an area in or out within a day or two. None of that holds at Black Mountain. The boulder field has no soil layer at all in most sections, which means no footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing for a tracker to read. The gaps between boulders extend downward into voids that searchers cannot see from above and frequently cannot access even with ropes, because removing one boulder to reach a void can shift the boulders around it. Police involved in past searches have described having to call off attempts entirely, not because they had exhausted the search area, but because continuing risked burying a rescuer alongside whoever they were looking for. Specialist caving equipment, the kind that can be lowered into a known vertical shaft, is frequently useless here because the voids inside Black Mountain are not single shafts, but a connected branching network with no reliable map and no two access points guaranteed to lead anywhere near each other. A missing person at Black Mountain is not simply hard to find. In a meaningful number of cases, they are structurally unfindable, sealed inside a formation that nobody, including trained search and rescue teams with the right equipment, can safely take apart. That single fact does more to explain the mountain's reputation than any ghost story attached to it. A place doesn't need to be supernatural to become legendary. It just needs to consistently defeat the normal process by which missing people get found. There is a detail about Black Mountain that gets mentioned constantly and explained rarely. The mountain makes noise. Locals living near it for generations have described hearing loud cracks, sometimes compared to gunfire or distant dynamite, coming from inside the rock pile with no visible cause, often loud enough to carry well beyond the boundary of the national park itself. The explanation, once you go looking for it, is mundane and slightly unsettling at the same time. Granite expands when it heats up under direct tropical sun and contracts sharply when a sudden downpour cools it. Do that often enough, for long enough, and individual boulders eventually fracture under the stress, sometimes violently enough to be heard from a significant distance. One local account collected decades ago described it plainly. In summer, when the rock gets very hot, a sudden cool downpour forces the boulders to contract, and occasionally the pressure is so great a boulder will explode, audible for miles like dynamite detonating. The same account notes pale, powdery patches scattered across the mountain's surface, marking the exact spots where a previous explosion had occurred, a kind of visible scar tissue left behind on the rock itself. What makes this detail worth dwelling on is not the explanation itself, but what it implies. The mountain is not a static, inert pile of rock sitting quietly in the landscape. It is still actively changing, still cracking, still rearranging its own internal structure, decades and centuries after the boulders first settled into place. Every loud crack from inside Black Mountain is a small reminder that the maze beneath the surface is not fixed. The voids a search team mapped last year may not be the same voids that exist today, which on its own is enough to explain why repeated searches of the same general area can produce completely different results. The wildlife that exists nowhere else. Here is something that almost never makes it into the disappearance stories, because it doesn't fit the tone. Black Mountain's boulder field is the only known habitat on Earth for 3 separate species. A frog, a skink, and a gecko, all found exclusively inside this one formation and nowhere else on the planet, not even in superficially similar boulder fields elsewhere in Queensland. Researchers studying these species have to work the same terrain that has defeated search and rescue teams navigating into the gaps and crevices by hand, often at significant personal risk, to document animals whose entire global population may number in the low thousands. Fieldwork here means crawling into the same dark, narrow spaces that have swallowed missing people, except deliberately, repeatedly, in pursuit of a creature small enough to disappear into a crack barely wide enough for a human hand. The conditions that make the mountain so dangerous to humans, the absence of soil, the deep, stable, dark voids between boulders, the consistent internal temperature insulated from the tropical heat outside, are exactly the conditions that allowed these three species to evolve in total isolation, cut off from related populations elsewhere by terrain too hostile for almost anything else to cross. It is a strange kind of symmetry. The same physical structure responsible for swallowing missing people without a trace has also, over a much longer timescale, manufactured three entirely unique forms of life that exist nowhere else in the world. Danger and biodiversity, produced by the exact same pile of rock, neither one cancelling the other out. What the searchers actually found it is worth being specific about what little physical evidence the documented disappearances have ever produced, because the vagueness is part of what keeps the legend alive. In the case of the two cattlemen who went missing in 1882, one man eventually walked out alive but could not coherently explain where he had been or what had happened during the time he was gone. That detail tends to get told as evidence of something uncanny. Read differently, it describes a man who had likely been lost, dehydrated, and disoriented in extreme heat for an extended period, conditions well known to produce genuine memory gaps and confused, inconsistent recollection with no supernatural explanation required at all. In the 1928 case, the prospector's body was eventually recovered, along with his rifle, and a gunshot wound was noted, though the precise circumstances were never conclusively settled. A bushranger and his companions reportedly vanished into the boulder field rather than face capture, and the police search that followed found nothing, not bodies, not horses, not equipment. Whether that means the men successfully evaded the search, perished somewhere inaccessible, or something else happened entirely, is a question the existing record simply cannot answer with confidence either way. This is the genuinely uncomfortable part of the Black Mountain story. It is not that the evidence points towards something inexplicable. It is that the terrain itself is so effective at destroying or concealing evidence that in case after case, there simply isn't enough information left to draw any firm conclusion at all. The mystery isn't built on strange clues. It's built on the near total absence of clues, in a landscape almost perfectly designed to produce exactly that outcome. What the traditional owners have always said: strip away the modern retellings and the core warning embedded in the place predates all of them. The Kuku Yalanji name, Kalkajaka, translates as place of the spear, and the site has long been understood by traditional owners as carrying genuine spiritual danger, distinct in kind from other significant sites nearby. Traditional owners do not enter the formation. That is not framed as superstition by the people who hold that knowledge. It is framed as an accurate, tested understanding of a specific place, arrived at across a far longer span of time than any European account of the mountain has existed. What is striking, looking at the full picture, is how little daylight there actually is between that traditional position and what the physical evidence independently supports. The mountain is dangerous. People who enter it sometimes do not come back. And when they do, the terrain has frequently destroyed whatever evidence might explain what happened to them. Two entirely different ways of knowing. One carried in story across thousands of years. One built from 20th century police reports and geological surveys arrived at functionally the same conclusion. Stay out. Black Mountain does not need an invented explanation. It has a real one, built from granite, gravity, heat, and gaps deep enough to defeat anyone who goes looking. That happens to be more unsettling than a ghost story, not less, because it means the danger is permanent, ongoing, and entirely indifferent to whoever walks toward it next. If this is the kind of Australian story you want more of, subscribe and tell us in the comments which strange corner of this country you think deserves the next look.